Okay, so you wake up, you shower, you grab your coffee, you're looking good, you're passionate about your goals, and you've got a great attitude. So what? You can have all the motivation in the world, but if you got no plan, you cannot get to where you want to go. Enter Pat McDaniel. He's the founder of WiseInsights.net, and today he tells us about his 5-step process to making better and more successful decisions, right here on the Peak Performers Podcast.
Welcome to this edition of Peak Performers Podcast with your host, Thor Conklin. Thor will be sharing the necessary tools, strategies, and psychology you'll need to become a peak performer in any area of your life or business.
Pat, thank you so much for joining us today. I want to jump right into it. I noticed that you have an ebook, The 5-Step Process to Making Better and More Successful Decisions. I think every entrepreneur wants to learn more about this area. Fill us in on some of this.
Well, the ebook came out of my own journey. I started doing some reading, and I was absolutely shocked that the decision-making process is, well, number one, it's fairly haphazard. And so nobody makes good decisions all the time. We all find ourselves regretting certain things, or at least feeling like a decision didn't turn out as well as you had hoped. And I remember reading a book, a great book that I would recommend to all your listeners, Chip and Dan Heath, called Decisive. And in there, they talked about all these areas that business leaders are super deliberate. Okay, so for example, they looked at the 20,000 executive searches. We're looking for the certain kind of a person who's a fit for our culture and our business, who will take us to a certain place. And very deliberate process and a lot of the dance going on. But then over time, what they realized was, after they looked at the results, 40% of all these senior level hires that were carefully chosen were gone in 18 months. And so it was one of those things, and you can talk about mergers and acquisitions, 83% of those fail to help the company, even though they spend $1 gazillion analyzing everything. So the reality is, even when you're careful, even when you're deliberate, your decisions don't turn out well. So to me, it made a lot of sense to go back and try to figure out how to do a better job. And one of the problems in decision making is that we tend to use flawed processes. We tend to kind of fall into our own mental models of how we make decisions. And in the end, if you have the wrong map, I don't care how carefully you follow it, you're going to end up in the wrong place.
And how do we make those decisions?
Well, so I'll kind of give you a framework for the 5-step process. The first step is basically to be a little bit more open on decisions, because here's the problem. I think we've all gone through this. We say we want to make a decision and we're looking at options, but we tend to have a favorite option, and we look for sort of confirming information as to why that decision, or why going in that direction is going to make the most sense. And that's a huge mistake. So the first step is just to be open to anything and everything, and leave everything on the table. I mean, within reason. Obviously, you don't have 22 choices, or you'll never make a decision.
Right. Yeah, we want to make ourselves right. So let's build a case to direct ourselves into making ourselves sound like we made a right decision.
Correct. And part of the problem with the decisions is the part of the flawed process is what they call the single option approach. Sort of the classic, should I marry this woman or not? Should I take this job or not? Should I move to this city or not? And as Chip and Dan talk about, they say, if you say the word or not, then you're on very, very terrible footing, because they did a huge study with several corporations, and they realized that the decisions they made with the single option approach were enormously poor compared to the other ones. They had 6 times better results when they had multiple options. So the whole point is, step one is just to be open to whatever options, and then the second step is to, expand your options, because that's another real challenge for folks. It's just thinking up options. They tend to say, well, I can see this one, I can see maybe 2, but I can't see any more than that. And when you actually go back and follow a couple of the exercises that are in the ebook, you come up with 6 or 7 before you know it, and you're going to go, I just didn't see those.
That is great advice. I have a mentor of mine that says, if you have one choice, that's no choice. If you have 2 choices, that's a dilemma. It's not until you get to 3 choices that you actually have a choice to make.
That's a great statement, because a lot of times, and it's just like when you go buy things, if you have three choices, you can kind of triangulate between those and be able to see where the advantage is on one particular option over the other.
You know what I'd love to do as well? I don't know if this fell into any of your research, but when I'm doing a selection process, I'm looking at a whole bunch of different things. And then what I do is I go, no, 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 no. And that's the kind of how I narrow it down to my 3, 4, or 5. But I want to see a huge field first. Even if, 8 of them don't make any sense, I want to have them kind of in the field at first so I can literally just go, okay, no. And those are real easy just to eliminate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a lot of times the options are just clearly not feasible, and so you can rule them out. The thing you have to be careful about, though, is there are certain undercurrents that go on in decision making, and part of the problem is you'll look at something and you'll pull it out instead of saying, I'm going to leave it on the table a little longer because it would be great if it could work out. I just don't see how it could. And so because you don't see how it could, you take it off the table instead of leaving it on the table.
So number 3, what happens on the third step?
The third step is to what we call exposure bias. And the reality here is that there are a number of biases that we have. We can't see them. We can't tell. We're like fish in the ocean. We can't tell that we're wet, but it's kind of how we operate. And so if we're not exposing some of these biases and trying to figure out how do I counteract them, then you will invariably make a very bad decision. So I'll use one that we all know, but just talk about how this affects us in decision making. So we've all heard, and we've certainly seen this with the political season just wrapping up. Actually, it's continuing. And that is the whole confirmation bias. We tend to look for information that confirms our prejudices and what we want to hear. And they did this really fascinating research study. They stuck a bunch of people in these MRI machines, and they watched their brains when they were going through some information. And so what happened was that they had candidates they liked and they had candidates that they didn't like. And what they noticed was when they started to feed the person information about the candidate that they didn't like, and it was like good stuff and bad stuff that they had done, all they heard was the bad stuff. They just tuned out the good stuff. And then when it came to their favorite candidate, just the opposite happened. They absolutely, parts of their brain did not even light up, like they didn't hear it, the bad stuff. And so, for us, we have to understand that there are a number of things that tend to distort the way we view reality. And the confirmation bias is just one of them. So we've got to kind of go back through and understand areas of our life that we have biases. I can get you into the one that I have, which I think is probably fairly common. It's called the predictive bias or the optimism bias. And that one is, we all tend to think everything's going to turn out so much better than it often does. And so, as a case in point, business owners who are going to launch a new business, we all know the statistics, which is it's a fairly low percentage of new businesses that get off the ground and stay a viable operation after 5 years. Yet, when you were to ask people, and they did this for people beginning a restaurant, and the failure for restaurants is 60%. But when they asked these folks, how do you feel about your success of your venture? 81% said they were very confident, very strongly confident mine was going to succeed. 33% said 0 chance of failing. They tend to say to themselves, well, the odds don't apply to me, or, whatever. And so we need to recognize that there are certain things that we tend to lean to the left accidentally or, unknowingly. And we need to figure out ahead of time, how do we counteract these things so that we can make better decisions for the future?
Yeah, all my bad decisions always started out with a really good idea. We never go into something going, this is a bad idea. Well, let's do it anyway, right? I think we all suffer from that.
Absolutely. And there are things you can do to deal with, it could be a good idea, but it's a half-baked idea. Or you just, what Daniel Kahneman talks about is you don't know what you don't know. And we make decisions on what he says is what we see is all there is. So based on what I see right now, this is a great decision. And yet, there's a lot of variables out there that you're not factoring in. So, one of the things you can do is what psychologist Gary Klein calls the pre-mortem. What could possibly go wrong in this decision? And really think those things through. And, we say, oh, it won't happen. But if it did, just think them all out. Then start to come up with scenarios, sort of the if-then scenarios on how you're going to deal with them if they do happen. And guess what? A lot of times they do happen. But now you're going to be prepared when you're not in the heat of the battle and the emotions are strong and all that kind of throwing good money after bad. And so think ahead about how things could possibly go wrong. And that's one real nice way to counteract the optimism bias.
Yeah, and I always like throwing that on a chart also is what's the likelihood of it happening, and then also what is the severity. So if it has a high severity and a low likelihood, that's one risk. But if it has a high frequency and a high severity, well, that's probably an area you want to avoid. That might be like diving with great white sharks while bleeding. Maybe not a good idea.
But that grid that's a fabulous grid. I think that we tend to view all options and all risks as being equally likely or equally good or bad, and that's really, really huge mistake.
Yeah, no question. I remember years ago I was working in New York City, and we had a 500-year flood, and it took out our office on Water Street. Go figure. Water Street, Lower Manhattan. And it flooded it for 2 weeks, and there was no contingency plan. It was in a floodplain. Nobody at the organization thought to have a contingency plan for a flood on a street called Water Street. Not a good idea. You've got to plan for the unexpected. I had, many people know my story. My office was in the World Trade Center. So, I've seen my share of disasters and things that you would never think could occur. But the unthinkable does occur, and you've got to have some contingency plans if they do.
Correct.
So what's number 4?
All right, so the fourth step is what I call escape your emotions. And what your readers are not realizing is how clever I have been up to this point, because every one of my points has started with the letter E. Unfortunately, the fifth one doesn't, because I could not figure out how to make that work. So escape your emotions. And we all know that our emotions can tend to distort and derail kind of the direction we want to go. There's all sorts of evidence, all sorts of studies that talk about making bad decisions when you're overly emotional and things like that. So that one is something where we have to really clearly think through that. And so one of the areas is what they call the irrational fear of loss. And sometimes you make decisions and you make your plans built on just irrational things that are really emotional based and not necessarily fact based. So as one example, and this was a story that Daniel Kahneman in his book Thinking Fast and Slow tells, which I thought was a great read, and your listeners would really enjoy that particular book. But
I hope you're going to tell the story that I think you're going to tell. There's a great story for this one. Go ahead. Are you truly living your potential? Are you getting the results that you need, want, and desire? There was a time in my life where I was not, and I needed answers. For the last 16 years, I've been obsessed with the question of why some people achieve massive results and others do not. And I found out that it comes down to one thing: execution, and the ability to take your ideas and plans and dreams and turn them into reality. That led me to the question, what are peak performers doing that others are not doing? How do they think? How do they act? What is behind the science of execution? I have now uncovered the secrets to the science of execution, and I want to share them with you. I have an intensive 3-day event called the Business Execution Summit. If you are truly committed to taking your game to the next level and mastering the science of execution, the most important skill that you will ever acquire, simply take your phone and text the word BE Summit, one word, to 41411, and I'll send you out some additional information on our upcoming event.
Well, so the story is he walks in one day and he's got these coffee mugs, and they for his class, he's teaching at a university, and the coffee mugs have the university logo on them. And he hands out the coffee mugs to half of the class, and the other half of the class does not get a coffee mug. Okay. Then he conducts a little experiment. And the experiment basically says to the one group, that does not have a coffee mug, how much would you pay for a coffee mug like this? And he holds it up that has this logo and looks great. And what they said was the general consensus, averaging it out, was $2.87. Now, they asked the other group who had the coffee mugs. They were given to them free, but there is something about ownership and possession that distorts everything. And this is back to that kind of, you never know what's going on at the emotional level. And they were asked, how much would you sell this coffee mug for? And, the number came out to be $7.12. Not even close. But for them, that was now the value of this coffee mug because it was theirs. You look at the same thing with the IKEA effect, where anything that you build tends to have greater value in your eyes than it really is. So you have to kind of go back and look at these areas that you're making decisions and influenced by things that kind of touch you at emotional levels. And there's things you can do. I think the biggest thing you can do is bring in other people, because a lot of times, they're not caught up in the emotions of things, and they can kind of give you a perspective. Another way you could do it is, how would you counsel somebody else on this particular decision? Because sometimes you would view it differently if you were telling somebody else, this is what I would do if I were you. Now, if it were me, I'd do it differently, that kind of thing. So again, exposing your bias and then dealing with the emotional side, which is the step number 4.
Yeah, the story that I was thinking about was a study where, and I'm not going to get this exactly right, maybe you can fill in the details if you're familiar with it, where they took 2 people and there was $100 on the table. And basically, the person had to offer the other person less than 50% and see if they would take the deal, and they would split it. And basically, the study showed that at some point, the person that was getting the raw end of a deal or the smaller end of a deal would actually blow up the deal for everybody, and neither party would win.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Where people would just say, look, if this isn't going to be fair, if we're not going to split this, and you're taking advantage of me, I'd rather nobody get any money. And it was shocking. I forget the name of the report. Are you familiar with that study?
Absolutely. And but that's a great example of the sort of the emotional level. I mean, Dan Ariely talks about predictably irrational. There's just a lot of things that we do as human beings that makes no sense when you say you could walk away with money you didn't have before, but because you didn't have as much as you could have, you're willing to throw it all away.
Yep. Thank you so much for listening today. I really do appreciate your time, and I hope you found today's show valuable. If you would like to receive these shows automatically to your phone or to your computer, simply go to iTunes and subscribe. After listening to several of the shows, if you're so inclined, please leave us a 5-star rating, as this helps us reach additional people and spread the message. If you're truly committed to taking your life to the next level and doing whatever it takes to become a peak performer, but something's holding you back, something is blocking your way, and you just can't seem to figure out what it is, send me an email to info@thorconklin.com. And I'd be more than happy to get on the phone with you. We'll schedule a 15-minute discovery call. No obligation, no cost. I absolutely love to hear from the listeners. And if there's something I can do to help, I'd be more than happy to do that. Also, if you found something of great interest in today's show and you want to share that with your friends and family, simply go to my Facebook page, Thor Conklin. Click on the episode, hit the share button, and share it on your page. You can follow me at Twitter at Thor Conklin. The website is thorconklin.com. We're constantly adding new free resources, discussing additional tricks, tips, tools, and strategies on how to be a peak performer. Remember, I try to keep these episodes short so you can listen to them during dot time, doing other things, commuting, driving, walking, working out. Decide to be a peak performer in all that you do. And until tomorrow, have an absolutely amazing day.